The top 10 lessons learned from 2024 fantasy football. The season is all but in the books. If your fantasy league properly plays a game of fantasy football, your championship was in week 17. Now, we recognize some of you might be playing into week 18. This is your sign to talk to your commissioner and say, hey, let's cut this week 18 stuff. Saquon Barkley might not even be playing this week. So we're going to take a quick recap and look back at the top 10 things we have learned from 2024 fantasy football. Some of these things are going to be items that we've reiterated throughout the course of the season, have reiterated in past seasons. Some of these are brand new things that have popped up and have given us a fresh perspective on how we want to view fantasy football moving forward. So Cameron, I'll start with you here. We each brought 3 things to the table that we've learned, and we have one like collective, I think we all can agree, let's make sure we hammer this point home at the end of the episode. But I'll start with you in your first lesson learned from the 2024 season.
Yeah, buy on those late round rookie wide receivers, not late round NFL draft wide receivers.
Correct.
Late round fantasy football wide, right? I'm not trying to tell you to buy in on the Puka Nakuas every single year and hit your darts.
Or the Javon Bakers.
Exactly. Those guys miss a lot more than they hit. What I'm trying to tell you is to buy in on guys like Brian Thomas Jr. and Ladd McConkey, who are going in the 8th, 9th, 10th round of some drafts, wide receiver 40 and beyond. Even Xavier Worthy could be in on this. Obviously, Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't fit this mold. So don't put it in the comments. Well, what about him? No, he was a first round pick. We're talking about those guys falling in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th round who are highly drafted in the NFL draft, who you think are going to be good players, because more often than not, especially down the stretch, these guys pay off. We saw it with Brian Thomas Jr., who's the wide receiver 4 this season. Ladd McConkey's wide receiver 12. Even Xavier Worthy's the wide receiver 29, who's been playing very well as of late. If you remember last year where we had Rashee Rice come on at the end of the season, we saw it from Jalen Waddle a couple of years ago, right? There's countless examples that we can just go through of guys who are falling in these later rounds, but were super highly drafted, and people are just like, but they're a rookie. It's not a great situation. I mean, you look at Brian Thomas, for example. It's been an awful situation in Jacksonville with Mac Jones throwing him the ball, but he's a talented enough wide receiver that he figured it out over the back half of the season and has been a league winner. So we would just continue to bet on these guys because more often than not, they're paying off for where you're drafting them.
And specifically over the back half of the season, it typically takes these younger wide receivers at least half of the season to get acclimated. Like we're looking from week 11 on. Brian Thomas Jr., the wide receiver 3 in fantasy points per game. Ladd McConkey, the wide receiver 12, both averaging over 19 fantasy points per game from week 11 on. I mean, these are dudes you should bet on every year, especially in a class as talented as it was. We all knew that coming in, that this was a very deep and a very talented wide receiver class. So these guys who, like you said, Cameron, are going in the 8th, 9th, 10th round. Like, let's bet on those guys instead of trying to push a Joshua Palmer up the board, instead of betting on a often injured Christian Watson. I'm trying to think of other guys who are going in that range. Those are the 2 names that come to the top of my head. But yeah, Ty, I mean, this is a strategy you have to be in on going forward. If these classes are going to be this stacked with this much talent coming out and they're sliding into the later rounds, these are some of the best lottery ticket picks you can make.
Yeah, no doubt. And the number one, I'll say the number one thing to look for with these kind of wide receivers, right? Brian Thomas Jr., Ladd McConkey, is talent, right? Cam said it kind of towards the beginning of his argument. We're not saying every single late round fantasy rookie wide receiver has to be drafted, right? But if you believe in the talent, regardless of the situation, talent should win out. Malik Neighbors, right? Yes, he was a higher draft pick. I don't think any rookie wide receiver had a worse situation than Malik Neighbors, and he still came through. Yep. So if you believe in the talent, they will come through eventually in fantasy. You may have to wait a while, but they will eventually come through.
Talent eventually wins out. So let's pour one out for my boy Javon Baker, who was a late round fantasy pick and a late round NFL draft pick. That was not a player you should have bet on this year.
Bring your popcorn. I make people in wheelchairs stand up.
I forgot about that.
Of course, I've got that on lock. You brought it up and I wasn't ready. I'm like, oh crap, that would have been the perfect time to click it. Ty, I'll come to you. What is your first lesson learned from the 2024 season?
The wide receiver push on draft boards went too far this year. 10 running backs this year through 17 weeks of the season. I know that we have one more week, but 17 weeks, 10 running backs average 17 fantasy points per game to just 11 wide receivers average 17 fantasy points per game. So there's no statistical like advantage to trying to stack up on receivers early and often compared to running backs. And when you look at the first 50 picks of your fantasy drafts this year, 24 of them were receivers and 17 of them were running backs. So nearly 50% of your first 50 picks were wide receivers. And specifically in your first rounds, then they typically consisted of 7 to 8 receivers, 4 to 5 running backs. Some of these running backs that got pushed down draft boards because of these receivers trying to sneak into the end of the first round. We're talking Jahmyr Gibbs. We're talking Kyron Williams. We're talking Derrick Henry, Devon Achane, Josh Jacobs. There were some other names out that I've specifically chose to leave off, but those 5 running backs were difference makers in fantasy this year, right? And they got pushed because people are trying to get cute with receivers and trying to sneak them into the first round because I don't know when I'm going to get a receiver. Hey, let this be a note to you. There are plenty of receivers in fantasy. You don't need to try to force it early, right? The biggest thing that we need to learn from this is that this is just a very format specific lesson, right? The wide receiver push does not work in all formats. This started in best ball because you were starting 3 wide receivers in a flex.
Correct.
But in your regular leagues, you're playing 2 receivers in a flex. And it may not sound like it's a lot. It's a world of a difference, okay? So next year, I'm going to be interested to see how the community, how other experts correct their running backs on their draft boards, because a ton of people paid this year for taking wide receivers like Marvin Harrison Jr., Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua instead of those running backs that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, let's do a little bit of speculating around that because I think we could sit here and continue to harp on that point. But I think what's going to be fascinating to see is what is the correction made next year? And my worry is that the industry actually overcorrects, and all of a sudden we're seeing an imbalance of 65% of running backs going in the first round compared to 35% of wide receivers. Where do you lie on that, Cameron? You did a fun little exercise today, and you don't have to share it with everybody, but you did a fun little exercise of like, what do the first couple of rounds look like in fantasy football drafts this year? Where did you land on that as you went about that exercise?
Yeah, it just feels like there's gonna consistently be a dead zone, like that 4, 5, 6 round where you're taking guys and you're kind of having these high expectations, but they just don't quite live up to it. This year it just happened to be all wide receivers. Usually it's all running backs, right? We call it the running back dead zone. This year, in the 4th round, you're looking at guys like DK Metcalf, Michael Pittman, Cooper Kupp, right? And so you're seeing a lot more of those players going ahead of Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara. And I think part of the reason that is you had a lot of aging running backs this last year. Guys getting up 27, 28, find themselves in new situations. And so we just got too scared off of, I just don't want anything to do with it. But I think we all realize too, you just need to take good play. Well, I can't even go because these are other lessons. I'm going to steal my own lesson if I go into that. But yeah, I think it'll be more of a solid mix. I think too, we project a lot, right? We take players who are, okay, this is going to be great. Like, I just had someone. Chris Olave is a guy that's
great, yeah, great example.
Year of his career, right? Where he's gonna finally take the step, so I need to push him up because we see, and I think that happens a lot more with wide receivers because the younger wide receiver crop has really taken over. So we push some of these other guys up that don't quite meet what we would think of as round 2, 3, 4 wide receivers, and so I think this next year probably going to balance out a little bit more, but I am on your side, Lucas, of it might swing back the other way because it just burned so many people in really the first year that we saw the entire fantasy football community make the switch. It burned a lot of people this year.
I think that's what we're going to see. And I hate to say like my strategy, of course my strategy is going to change, but I really do think people are going to get running back crazy next year. And I think I'm still going to be in on so many wide receivers early because, to prove this year, again, I don't want to get into other lessons we've learned, but like when guys like Chase Brown, Bucky Irving, Chuba Hubbard come out of the wood. Like those are 3 waiver wire running backs essentially that you would have been able to pick up or take within the last 3-4 rounds of your fantasy drafts to actually, you know what, have a very solid running back core over the back half of the season. So again, I'm really curious to see how the industry corrects itself going into the 2025 season. Before I get into my first lesson learned, I want to make sure we talk to the people over on YouTube. Yes, the fantasy football season is over, but our content is not over. We are still bringing you 2 videos a week throughout the offseason. We're shifting our focus to Dynasty and the NFL draft specifically. So make sure you subscribe here, turn on those notifications as well so you know when all of our newest episodes are up. If you're a fan of fantasy football, you're a fan of the NFL, I promise you, you are thoroughly going to enjoy our channel because that is all we focus on is NFL content, fantasy football content to give you an upper edge in your leagues. We started talking about my first lesson learned a little bit, and this is one that I'm like, I think I'm truly taking to heart, but I'm also still trying to figure out what to do with it because I think we just need to have more grace for aging running backs on new teams. Right. This is specifically the Derrick Henrys, the Saquon Barkleys, Joe Mixon, Josh Jacobs, maybe a little bit too much dynasty brain going on here coming into redraft season because the shelf life for these running backs is always shorter. Typically when these guys hit their first contract negotiation in dynasty formats, you're like, okay, this is kind of my cue to get out. The production always declines in the back half of their careers. And it always comes with that second contract. They get franchise tag for a year or two. But then once that next contract comes, it's like, okay, well, it's typically not with a favorable team. But I think that's the common denominator here with all 4 of these running backs to an extent is that these dudes ended up on significantly better teams than the situations in which they came from, right? I mean, you go from the Tennessee Titans to the Baltimore Ravens. Like we had concerns about that Ravens offensive line. Regardless, that is a significant upgrade offensively. The Giants to the Eagles, right? That's like the biggest upgrade at the mall for Saquon Barkley. The Raiders to the Packers, yes. You know what? That's a significant offensive upgrade. Joe Mixon, the Bengals to the Texans, I think that kind of ends up being a wash based on the system that Bobby Slowick put in place this year, which was basically like just feed Joe Mixon until he has no more legs to run with. But typically, again, when we see these running backs hit their second contract, they decline in production, but all of these dudes are having phenomenal years. I mean, we're getting an all-time season from Saquon Barkley. Derrick Henry, he's averaging 5.8 yards per carry at 31 years old this year. I just think we need to have a little bit more grace and take in situation and offenses that they're entering into and factor that in a bit more instead of just saying, you know what, these dudes are old on their second contracts. It's a formula that we've been able to use since the beginning of fantasy football to basically say, I'm out. I want nothing to do with them. But they've all proved us wrong this year. And I think it really is because they all ended up in significantly better situations.
Yeah, I think too. I just want to add to your thing. Good aging running backs in new homes.
Yes.
Right. I think that is something
that's
too.
Also important.
You look at Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Joe Mixon, supremely talented running backs.
Zach
right?
Moss.
Exactly. But that's the thing. We got excited about Zach Moss because he's going into that role, but he's just not a great runner. Devin Singletary, another good example. Going into
Gus Edwards.
But he's just Gus Edwards, just not great running backs. I'm looking at the free agents for next year. Aaron Jones is a guy that I think a lot of people are going to be out on no matter where he goes because he's going to be 31. He looks really good right now. He's another guy I'm going to be okay taking a chance on as long as he's in a, like you said, a good situation.
Offense. Yes.
Yeah, if he just goes chases a bag and plays in Vegas or something like that, I'm
No
probably out. But a Najee Harris, I might not be as inclined to because he's just not that same tier of running back where I think he can continue to make a jump forward. So I do think that that's a good disclaimer. But yeah, I think we just got, like you said, I think dynasty brain's the perfect way to put it. We were like, he's 27 years old. Oh no, we got to be. No, he's still in his prime. He's still a good running back. So I think that's part of it as well, for sure.
Is there anything, Ty, and I'll kind of let you answer this question. Is there anything to be said about the tread on these guys' tires too? Like Saquon Barkley has missed a good chunk of previous seasons because of injury. Now, granted, injury itself adds wear and tear onto the body, but I think there's something to be said too about actually Saquon has probably a bit more tread left on the tires than 27 years old might indicate. Same with Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry has all the touches in the world. He doesn't have much tread left on his tires. But like with Saquon Barkley specifically, I think that's one that, like, again, maybe that's something we underestimated a little bit. Joe Mixon, really wasn't the guaranteed workhorse in Cincinnati until the last couple of years there. So is there something to be said about, like, we also just might need to take into account how much tread is left on the tires, how many touches these guys have actually had? Again, like, I'm trying to find the perfect way to remedy age, situation, touches. Like, I don't think any of us saw Derrick Henry averaging 5.8 yards per carry this year and being as efficient as he's been with the football. So I don't know, how else do we kind of remedy this reality of aging running backs in new homes?
You absolutely still have to keep the tread on the tires a part of the equation. To throw that completely out of the window, I think is malpractice, because my thing with Josh Jacobs was, again, the guy was going back to back seasons of at least 250 touches, right? Like, yes, he was still 26, but I think Aaron Jones is like the perfect example of this. He only had the entire backfield in Green Bay for maybe a season or two. Other years, he's splitting time with AJ Dillon. So now this year going to Minnesota, yes, he's older. Yes, he's gotten a ton of work, but it's not workhorse work, right? Now, you had asked about like Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. I think it's I don't want to say riskier, but because you know how much they were relied on their old teams, it is more noteworthy than some other guys that were in timeshares and now get a workhorse role. So again, like I said, it's completely malpractice to just throw that completely out the window and to not say that's a big piece of the puzzle here, but it has to count for something.
So this will be interesting. I'm curious to see where the Saquon Barkleys, the Joe Mixons, the Derrick Henrys actually end up in drafts next year, because is lightning going to strike twice with some of these guys? Can Derrick Henry make it happen at 32 years old? Will Saquon Barkley have another 2,000? I think it's reckless to project a 2,000-yard rushing season, but I mean, these are the questions we're going to be asking going into next year now too. So now that we have this new reality of good running backs upgrading to good teams, age is less of a factor in that. How does that impact year two on these teams then for these players? So something to keep an eye on as we go into next season, but we've berated that point quite a bit already. Cameron, I'll kick it to you. What is your second lesson learned from 2024?
Yeah, it's that good rushing quarterbacks are the cheat code, right? And we've said this over and over and over again. And you look at it this season, 8 of the top 11 quarterbacks had 300 plus rushing yards. 4 of the top
Kyler
6
in there. Sorry,
Yeah.
I was wondering if you were gonna cut out Kyler or not.
No, I had to add him. 4 of the top 6 had 530 or more rushing yards. We saw, Josh Allen having 12 rushing touchdowns. Jalen Hurts having 14 rushing touchdowns. You look at Jalen Hurts. Jalen Hurts has 2,900 passing yards and 18 passing touchdowns. And he is averaging 21.3 points per game because he has 630 rushing yards for 14 rushing touchdowns.
Yeah.
It makes such an impact. Those 2 other guys who are in the top 6 are Joe Burrow and Baker Mayfield, who are both on pace to hit 4,400 yards and 40 plus touchdowns.
Yeah. Which is what you need.
Yes, it has to be a crazy good year to be able to do that. You know how many quarterbacks hit 40 touchdowns last season? Zero.
Zero. Yeah. I was going to say
Zero.
Zero.
Dak Prescott had 3,600. That was it. There was no other quarterback with 40 touchdowns. So the fact we had 2 do it this year is amazing. Props to those 2.
Right.
But I just put that out there because that's not something you see every single year, right? We talk about Patrick Mahomes. He's the quarterback 10 right now. I mean, he barely hit 300 yards, but when you're not putting up multiple touchdown games, like 2-3 touchdown games every single week, it hurts you. Jared Goff having a phenomenal season, 4,000 yards, 33 touchdowns. He's the quarterback 8 right now. Right. It's just, you need to have that rushing upside to give you a little bit extra. And it just insulates you against bad games. Like if you've had Lamar, Josh Allen, Jaden Daniels, or Jalen Hurts on your team, you really have not felt like you've had a week where you're like, that stinks. Your worst week's like 17 points. So, it just makes such a good difference. And the reason I say good quarterbacks is we look at, unfortunately, Ty Anthony Richardson of we were too early. We were too early on Anthony Richardson, right? He had all these tools. He looked like he was going to be really good, but he just wasn't ready to fully take over the team this season, right? He didn't take that next step like you were projecting. And so, yeah, he's going to hit 500 rushing yards, but the rest, I mean, having 8 passing touchdowns and 12 interceptions kills you. So if you don't have any passing, then obviously it doesn't work quite as well. So good quarterbacks who have that rushing upside are just cheat codes for fantasy football.
I just think it's so important to continue hammering home that point because, I mean, this was the big thing we talked about with CJ Stroud or, in the preseason was he's going to need to throw 40 plus touchdowns to finish as a top 7 quarterback, let alone top 10, right? Like he was going to need to throw 40 touchdowns. And when you're handing the ball off to Joe Mixon 25 times a game, CJ Stroud just isn't going to have to throw 40 touchdowns. Granted, again, wide receiver injuries kind of factor into that, but even so, it really hasn't been a great year for CJ Stroud to any extent. So these mobile quarterbacks is the reason, like when we were so in on Anthony Richardson is because it's like, if he does put it together, if he does have a Jalen Hurts season where it's, well, what'd you say, Cameron? 18 passing touchdowns. That's all he's thrown this year. Like that's not unreasonable to ask for Anthony Richardson. Shoot, that's one a game. Just toss one a game. And even if you have to go every other game, throwing 2 touchdowns, like you still get there. Right. So I'm with you. Like, I'm going to continue betting on these mobile quarterbacks, but even more so, it's Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, or Jaden Daniels. And after that, I may as well kick the can until the last couple of rounds because, a lot of these middling quarterbacks, the Goffs, Baker Mayfield was a guy who fell. The Sam Darnold was going undrafted most. I mean, like, these are dudes you could just take in the last round of your draft. So if you could bet on the offense, if you could bet on the leap forward, like, either take your elite rushing guy right away. Frankly, I'm just going to wait to see who falls. And if I have to enter into the season and figure it out from there, like I could be in a lot worse spots than that. So Ty, where are you at on viewing quarterback going into next year? Because again, it's not debatable that rushing quarterbacks give you an edge. This has been proven now for at least 5 years in fantasy football, but how do you view it going into next year? Is it like basically a big 4 or bust? How do you balance and remedy this?
No, I share with you on the sense that like this is not a like you got to go get one of these guys, right? This is like it's not a must draft situation. But I think
one of those top 4 might be must draft for me, honestly. I mean, between Lamar, Josh Allen, and Jalen Hurts, I know I'm getting a top at least 5 guy. Like I can count on that.
I think maybe the better way to say it is this. If you are of the mind that one of these quarterbacks is a must draft player, you have to know what you're doing in every single other round of your draft. Yeah. Because if you don't go in with a strategy of what you're going to do everywhere else, and you're just going to be so fixated on getting one of these quarterbacks, the rest of your team is going to suffer, right? So there is a very specific strategy that you have to go into your drafts with if you're going to take one of these quarterbacks. So I think that's going to be this should be a fun exercise for us to do is like, hey, we see that Lamar Jackson, I mean, this past year, he was an early 4th round pick, right? How is your team going to look if you take Lamar Jackson at his ADP? What is the best team that you can build with Lamar Jackson, right? So that's something that I want to do as the fellas. But to your question, you can say that there's a guy that is a must draft, but you have to know what you're doing in every other round of your drafts.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good way of putting it because the price tag you're going to be paying on Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jaden Daniels, and Jalen Hurts next year, top 4 rounds for
50.
sure.
Top 50.
Yeah, top 50, which is going to be top 4 rounds for sure. So you have to know what you're doing, like you said, in your drafts afterwards. And this was, I was working with the theory prior to the season too of like, is it really just like Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts versus the field in fantasy football? Like, does it matter where I draft the rest of these quarterbacks? Like, if I just get a Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, like that's all I really care about. And like, it didn't pan out to perfection. Obviously, you get a Lamar Jackson, you get a Jaden Daniels, which is like Jaden Daniels was the screaming value of the year. But like, do I just draft one of those guys? It's those guys versus the field. I'm like, and that's kind of confirming my suspicions of like, let me grab one of those 4 guys and screw it. Like, I know I get a really, really good quarterback that way, and I don't have to be playing, waiver wire tag throughout the course of the season. I don't know. Is that a stupid theory, Cameron, to like put a bow on this thought?
No, I mean, it's just, you just look at it like Hurts was quarterback 6 in points per game at 21.3. Jordan Love right now, has been playing pretty well, but he's only got 83 rushing yards. The difference between Jalen Hurts and Jordan Love in points per game is bigger than the difference between Jordan Love and Mason Rudolph. Mason Rudolph is within 3 points of Jordan Love, whereas Jalen Hurts is almost 4.5 points more a game. So it's just, the difference is so big. You're just making up so much more points with these guys. And like I said, Jordan Love right now is averaging about 2 passing touchdowns a game. He's averaging over 260 passing yards a game. So he's playing well from a pocket pass, but if you just don't get that rushing, like you said, it just really is just such a cheat code.
Before we get too much further into the episode here, we got 6 more lessons coming for you, but let's take a quick break here from our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Today's podcast episode is brought to you by our friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Now, we love Underdog. It is the easiest place to play best ball formats, and they even have their own form of player props called Pick'em. You can make up to 20 times your money on a single night by correlating props together. 2 picks will triple your money, 3 will 6 times it, 4 will 10 times it, and 5 plays that all hit will multiply your entry by 20. You can even place insurance on your picks too, so if only 4 of your 5 props hit, you still get 10 times your entry. And if you use our code FELLAS when signing up, Underdog is going to double your first deposit up to $100. Alrighty, we are back. We're going to keep flying through our top 10 lessons learned. We've cranked through 4 so far. We got 6 to go. Ty, I really like your second lesson learned here because this was a hot topic all off season. I'm curious to see what kind of clarity you came up with.
Yeah, we need to pay better attention to these preseason running back competitions because there are 4 running backs that come to mind right away that I shouldn't say I generalize that as like the fantasy community. We're kind of on the fence about because we weren't really sure exactly how the backfield was going to look. And the 4 names that I came up with were Rico Dowdle, Chase Brown, Bucky Irving, Kenneth Walker. Obviously, Rico Dowdle is like the least sexy name on this list. But like, if we go all the way back to training camp, Rico Dowdle is a running back 45 in ADP to Zeke's running back 38. Rico Dowdle is the running back 16 since week 9, since he took over the backfield. Zeke's non-existent, right? Chase Brown. Let's go to Chase Brown. Running back 36 at draft time. Zach Moss was a running back 32. Obviously, Zach Moss got hurt, and Chase Brown has been the running back 4 since then. Bucky Irving, running back 52 to Rachaad White's running back 14, and Bucky Irving is now the running back 7 since taking over the backfield in week 10. Kenneth Walker, running back 17, Zach Charbonnet, running back 44. Kenneth Walker was the running back 10 in points per game before he started missing time with injuries, and Charbonnet was a running back 37. So it's not bad from either of them in their considering their ADP, but I'm old enough to remember that Kenneth Walker was getting some running back 1 rest of season talk because I was a part of it. I was very much a part of that.
I'm old enough to remember.
But here's the common thread in all of those situations, from as bad, I use that lightly, with Rico Dowdle and Dallas, to as good as it's been with Chase Brown and Bucky Irving. They all had positive buzz about them during training camp, right? Rico Dowdle and Chase Brown were the most electric backs in their camps. We heard that over and over and over again. The Buccaneers didn't outright say that they were going to get Bucky Irving more and more involved as the year went on, but there were reports that they wanted to give Bucky as many touches as possible, like throwing him on special teams, right? It's because they liked what they were seeing with Bucky Irving. Seattle coaches just outright said that Ken Walker was a 3-down back. So the lesson here, when there are 2 backs on a team and it's not clear to you who's going to be the best one, pay attention to the training camp buzz, because it's rarely going to lead you astray, right? And I'll say this too as a bow on top. It works the other way too.
I was going to say
Javonte Williams, right? The preseason talk report that everyone was like, that's not real, was that Javonte was not going to make the team, right? Obviously that was incorrect, but it was painting a picture about how the team feels about Javonte, because we've had a game with Audric Estime. We've had a game with Jaleel McLaughlin.
Tyler Bidet.
Right, exactly. Like we have no idea what that running back room is anymore at this point. So again, pay attention to training camp buzz. Keep your nose in it. If you're looking for maybe some value in your drafts, again, Chase Brown, Bucky Irving, Rico Dowdle, they were all going outside the top 35 running backs. And now look at where they are at this point in the year.
And I think an important note to remember out of this too is that, again, our over show that we all love, the Underdog Football Show, Fantasy Football with Josh and Hayden. I mean, they were saying it all off season, like attack ambiguity here in these backfields because one of these dudes is going to come out on top. The camp buzz led you right to Rico Dowdle saying he looks like the best back in camp. Okay, I'm going to, it doesn't get much more clear than that in terms of camp buzz. Obviously, Chase Brown, Zach Moss was a little bit difficult to diagnose because at the start of the season, it was Zach Moss who was outperforming Chase Brown from a fantasy perspective, and it just took the injury for Chase Brown to essentially take on the entire workload. But you attack the ambiguity, and I also think you don't get like take lock with it. I'll say, because I was very much like, look, Chase Brown played a lot of special teams last year. He looked explosive with the ball in his hands, but let's be honest, it was like 2 catches that he had last year that people remember. Now he's getting 20 touches a game and looks like the most explosive back on the field, right? Like that's me saying like, yeah, I got a little bit of take lock there and saying like, you know what, Zach Moss, I saw him do it in Indy. I haven't seen Chase Brown do it yet, but that was me getting stuck in take lock land. And Cameron, you were nodding in agreement there of like, we can attack ambiguity, but we also can't get take lock within that and attack it from both fronts.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think too, it's bet on the like the guy that looks better, right? When you're watching this, like when you're watching Rico Dowdle and Zeke at this point of his career, not that you're watching like preseason tape or anything, but even if you watched him last season, you just realize, okay, there's a little bit difference. And one, Rico Dowdle is going to be 27, but he's got 0 tread on those tires. Yeah. Whereas, Zeke's almost pushing 30. He's got as many carries as anybody else in the NFL. Take the guy that you probably are going to be like, okay, because that's the other thing too, when you look at this and you're looking at upside. Okay, if you were wrong and you were all in on Rico Dowdle and Zeke was the guy, what's the upside for Zeke? 40 yards and a touchdown every week? Right. That's the other side of it too, is sometimes we go, well, we can get the dirty points here, but it's, if you're taking 2 running backs in the 40s, why not take the guy that can be that top 20 running back as well? I think like you said, though, it's take, especially if you're in best ball. I think this is more of a best ball take of taking variety. Obviously, in your redraft, if you're in one,
a little bit here, but
yes. If you're in one home league, you just got to make a pick and you got to stick to it. Most teams you can follow the preseason buzz. If it's like there are coaches that I can't listen to. The 49ers. We'll talk about Kyle Shanahan a little bit later. Right? If Kyle Shanahan says anything, don't listen to it. Right? There are certain coaches that if buzz is coming out, you don't listen to a single word they say. But there are other
Doug Peterson.
No, and he's another one. Yeah.
Yes. But like Sean Payton, whatever comes out of Sean Payton is pretty much what's going to happen. Yeah. He's like, I don't like Judy. All right, we traded him. Right. I mean, he's like, Bo Nix is like, I love Bo Nix, and they have leaned on Bo Nix. So it's like, there's different, that's also something you kind of got to wade through too, of like certain people are going to tell you how it is. Certain people won't.
Dennis Allen was also one of those guys because Kendre Miller, man, was absolutely buried until
yes, the dude
back
had
after the season. Oh my God.
He died on that.
I want to know what kind of dirt Kendre Miller had on Dennis Allen. That was absurd. Anyways, but yeah, I think these preseason running back battles are so important to pay attention to because in best ball, you can attack it on all fronts. You can attack it on both fronts and make sure you get a healthy exposure to both. But in your redraft leagues, which I know a lot of people who watch this channel are much more invested in their redraft leagues. Yeah, I mean, just take the younger explosive back. More times than not, that's going to end up panning out than betting on the older veteran back. My second lesson learned from this year. Look, I said it was one of my favorite strategies coming into the year, and I thankfully invested in I made one of the guys my flag plan, so I invested in the right guy. But the elite tight end era, it's officially over. Travis Kelce, Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews, Trey McBride, Dalton Kincaid, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts. 6 to 7 tight ends were drafted in the first 5 rounds of fantasy drafts this year. Only 2 of them are now top 5 at the position in fantasy points per game, and only 3 of them have averaged more than 11 fantasy points per game. You want some extra context on that? there have been 43 wide receivers who have scored at least 11 fantasy points per game this year. So at that point, like most of these tight ends, we're not even looking at them until the 8th, 9th round of drafts. And that includes Mark Andrews. That includes Sam Laporta. Obviously, Dalton Kincaid and Kyle Pitts are just their own stories. But like the lack of touchdowns really hurt Travis Kelce this year. So could he bounce back next year? Maybe, but he's aging. You have Xavier Worthy coming on the back half of the season. You've got Rashee Rice, who will hopefully be back early next season. Maybe the Chiefs bring back a D-Hop in free agency. We'll see. Meanwhile, Mark Andrews, he's pretty much stayed relevant on touchdowns alone this year. Nobody's touching Dalton Kincaid or Kyle Pitts with a 1,000-foot pole going into the next season. And like Sam Laporta's had a fine bounce back in the second half of the season, but like, answer me this quick. Both of you, are either of you eager to spend a fourth or fifth round pick on Sam Laporta next year? My answer is no.
No, definitely not.
No.
So like it's Brock Bowers, it's Trey McBride, and people will probably disrespect George Kittle still because of Debo, of Ayuk coming back next year. But like those will probably be the only 3 tight ends who will be taken in the top 5 rounds next year. Because when all these dudes are getting stunted on by Jonnu Smith right now, like it's just not worth the investment. Especially like a David Njoku even is getting a crap ton of targets as well. Like he's almost just as good, if not even better of a value than a Mark Andrews and a Travis Kelce this year. So the elite tight end era is over. It is no longer a thing. We've got like 2 dudes who you can confidently trust, and then like 2 more dudes where it's like, yeah, you know what? If they get the volume to fall their way, they're going to be fine options. So it's officially dead. It's over. I invested in it for 1 year, and thankfully I chose the right guy. But man, otherwise it has come back to bite you in the butt if you invested in elite tight end to try and get that upper hand.
Yeah, I think it is something too of we tried to project this too much this year. We took Sam Laporta and we saw, hey, 10 touchdowns. And we're like, okay, he's going to make this huge jump volume wise. Well, he didn't. He actually went, regressed a little bit, and the touchdowns didn't quite come. We looked at Dalton Kincaid and we said, ooh, ambiguity on this offense. He's going to take over the slot role. And he just wasn't that guy. Kyle Pitts, we're like, okay, this is finally going to be the year.
Kirk Cousins, baby.
Yes, we're projecting him to be there. Whereas Trey McBride last season, we saw volume on top of volume. That's what made Trey McBride. Brock Bowers this year. The reason we're confident in him in this year or next year, he's had us 144 targets. That's something, that's going to stay around a little bit, right? Especially as a rookie. So that's why. And then obviously you got Travis Kelce aging out. Mark Andrews is a little bit of a head scratcher for sure.
Yeah.
But it really is, unless they're elite and have done it for multiple, even Brock Bowers, I kind of go back and forth because, right, we just saw Evan Ingram kind of put up a similar type season. Only 1 season we've seen it from. At least Trey McBride, we've seen him for 2 seasons.
Yeah.
Right. So you're projecting, okay, it's something that we've seen continue to happen. But like you said, then you have Travis Kelce aging out. George Kittle's the only tight end I would trust to maintain what they're doing without insane volume because we've just seen it from him enough years. But yeah, like you said, you're not seeing 5 tight ends in the top 50 next year. At least you shouldn't. You should not be drafting 5 tight ends in the top 50 next year. So yeah, it's definitely going to look very different from the tight end position moving forward.
How many tight ends do you think go within the top 50 next year, Ty? I mean, my bet is 2. And it's
probably 2.
I mean, McBride and Bowers.
Yeah, that's it.
Just because it's volume. But I mean, this year, I don't want to say that like some of these, top end tight ends that also were going early kind of show their true colors this year. But I think we're reminded this year of just how fluky the tight end possession really is, right? Like we've been spoiled with Travis Kelce that year in, year out. He was just consistently going to give you 17, 18 points a week, right? I went back and looked at the last 4 years of some of these tight ends, right? Where first half of the year, you're kind of banking on these elite tight ends, but then in the second half of the season, something changes and it's unknown. I shouldn't say unknown guys, but guys you don't suspect to finish towards the top ultimately make the difference, right? We go back to 2021, Pat Freiermuth, tight end 25 at draft time, finishes the tight end 9 in the second half of the year in points per game. 2022, Evan Ingram, tight end 20 in ADP, tight end 7 in points per game the second half of the year. David Njoku, right? Tight end 9 in draft time, tight end 12, finished as the tight end 1. This year it's Jonnu Smith, undrafted, and now he's the 10-4 points per game in the second half of the year. I don't know if I'm going to be. I don't think I can outright say like I'm just going to punt on tight end next year.
No.
But the thing is that like you can't really tie yourself down to any one tight end, because second half of the season hits, something changes, and you don't know which one's going to be a consistent producer for you, or if they're just going to wet the bed every single week.
And again, this is similar to our quarterback discussion. If you choose to be in on a Brock Bauer, on a Trey McBride, you better have a plan on how you're going to build out the rest of your team. Because you're probably not going to be taking a Lamar Jackson or Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts with them if you want to have proper team construction afterwards. So, some people would have the counter argument then of like, well, then I get the sure things at the position. Well, but then if you lock yourself down to two sure things, all it takes is for one of those sure things to go wrong, and then you're scrambling from there. So, I digress. That's a moot point. That's a discussion to be saved for like July of 2025. But let's move on to our last 4 lessons learned here, fellas. We each have one more, and then kind of like a wrap up consensus one that I think will really put a bow on kind of the last stretch of lessons learned here. So Cameron, I'll let you start here. And let's keep these a little bit more brief. We could dive deep into these if we want to, but again, some of these really tie into each other. So Cameron, let's start with you. What is your third and final lesson learned?
Yeah, mine's pretty straightforward. It's draft good players on good teams, and specifically the running back position, because I think it affects them the most. Sometimes you'll get, the Brian Thomases of this year, right, where they're on a bad team and they just get crazy volume. But running the ball, you need to be on a good team. 9 of the top 10 running backs are on a team that is still in the playoff hunt or currently in the playoffs. The only running back in the top 10 who is not that is Alvin Kamara. And that's just because he's different, because he's seeing 90 targets this season. So, that does help his case a little bit. But, right, you look at the top 10 running backs and you just look at touchdowns they have. Saquon's got 15. Bijan's got 13. Henry, another 16. Even Achan's got 11. Josh Jacobs and I'm looking at the wrong thing. Yeah, Josh Jacobs and Kyron, both 15, 16. And then Kamara's only got 8. Right. So he needed that receiving work, but all these other running backs are finding the end zone. And that's what's really pushing them up, into the top 10. And even, you're looking at wide receivers. Most of these guys that are, your top 3 wide receivers right now, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown. Those are some pretty good offenses attached to some pretty good quarterbacks. So, even CeeDee Lamb was very good when Dak was playing. Obviously, the Cowboys weren't great, but the offense was good. So it's just stuff that you got to continue to look at when you're in between players, especially in those later rounds, right? If you get in the 5th, 6th round and you're like, oh, I could take, the guy who's going to see DeAndre Swift. I could take him, or I could take David Montgomery.
Who's on the better offense? I mean, that's an easy
one. Exactly. Better offense for Montgomery. He played much better throughout the season. And I think there's just Zamir White's a perfect example.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Now, he had a great 6 games, but he's not exactly a great player. We're taking him as the running back 22. We're taking him ahead of, I guess we're not taking the running backs really fell off quick. I forgot.
but that was the point. It fell off. No, 100%.
But but you're taking him right behind. I mean, Dave Montgomery is running back 21.
Yeah.
So people are making that decision right behind Aaron Jones. You take good players on good teams, because a lot of times if you take mediocre players on bad teams, hoping for volume, they lose the volume.
Yeah. I mean, Zamir White became irrelevant after what? Week 3?
Yeah.
I mean,
sure, yeah.
Yeah,
I was going to say week 1, but
you could say that. I was going to say I wasn't going to go quite that harsh, but like you can go week 2 even. I would give you. We can meet in the middle on that one. Anything you want to add to put a bow on that, Ty? Because I mean, I got nothing to add. That is like I saw a thread or an interaction between Josh Norris and Nick Ercolano BDGE this morning. Had Josh quote tweeted a tweet of Nick's, and he just said, "Good players on good teams," and Nick replied, "I'm convinced you could probably beat 85% of fantasy football managers if you just stick to this strategy." And honestly, I think at this point, 85% is a pretty good number if you just stick to this strategy in most cases.
Yeah. Again, not to say that like you just completely, cut out like 14 teams from your draft strategy, right? Because again,
Brian Thomas Jr. wouldn't have been drafted then.
Exactly. Right. Like there are still good players on bad teams that Devontae Adams was being taken as a top 10 receiver on the Raiders. Obviously he went to the Jets and things are a little bit different, but like we do need to just remember that you will earn more points in fantasy from guys that are on the top offenses. That's just how the game works.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We don't need to
And I guess
overcomplicate it.
Well, yeah, you could even just say draft good players, right? Because the guys who are flourishing on bad teams are good players, right? It
Yeah.
brings you back to Zamir White. If they're not a good player and they're in a bad situation all of a sudden, it's not going to be great.
Right. And again, I think DeAndre Swift is such a perfect example of
Yeah.
this too, because again, you look at it's like the volume with Zamir White then too. It's like, man, DeAndre Swift, he's a fine NFL player. He's not a good NFL player in that Bears offense. Holy crap, was that Bears offense just again,
Who could have saw that one coming?
I'll spare the words. I'll spare the Shane Waldron. I'll spare my Chicago Bears thoughts and instead give it to Ty to start bringing us home here with his final lesson learned.
Yeah, the 101 is cursed. It's cursed. There's no other way around it. If you were stuck with the 101, it's just going to be a rough season for you, I guess. At least over the last 5 years. I mean, we go back to 2020. Christian McCaffrey was the 101. He played only 3 games. Yeah, we go to 2021, and it's Christian McCaffrey again, and he played only 7 games that year. 2022, it's Jonathan Taylor because he broke out the year before. He missed 6 games, and then he's a running back 23 in points per game. 2023, it's Justin Jefferson because he broke out again. He missed 7 games. And then this year, Christian McCaffrey, I don't need to explain it to y'all. Y'all know what happened. What sucks the most about these is that these are not busts because of thought process or statistical arguments or anything like that. They have all just gotten injured. Like JT's the only one that didn't.
JT's the exception there. Yeah, he's the outlier.
Right. But all the other guys, when they were healthy, they played like the 101. But they've tanked your season because of missed time, right? And we take a look at the potential 101 next year. It's going to be between Saquon Barkley and Jamar Chase. Both guys are coming off career highs in touches, in yards, efficiency, in scoring. Jamar has an inevitable contract dispute this offseason. And for all we know, both players could have very different play callers and systems next year. For all we know, we don't know, but again, it's possible. So there's no other way around it. The 101 is cursed. You're going to have to make a tough choice. And the thing is, if you take anyone other than Saquon Barkley or Jamar Chase, you're going to look like a moron. So I don't want to say like
Nico Collins 101 next year. Anybody with me? Let's get funky with it.
Brian Thomas Jr.
I should just leave. I look at the time. I got to get home.
No, I obviously joking on that last hint, but I mean it's brutal, man. No matter what, you make the wrong decision, and I don't know. Maybe in some ways, it is a little bit more of a blessing next year to have a 50-50 shot rather than the 101. It's like it's CMC this year. 101 was pretty consensus Justin Jefferson. I mean, in previous years, it feels like it's kind of been a foregone conclusion. Maybe this year it's a little bit more in 2025, assuming it's between Jamar Chase and Saquon Barkley. Maybe a slight blessing in disguise. You get a 50-50 shot. Or if both flop, then everybody's just in misery. You and the 102. But any icing on the cake you want to put on there, Cameron?
No, you just got to take the best player. Then you just got to live with whatever happens.
You got to live with
football. You don't control you can't control injuries. We'll talk about that a little later, but
we'll get to that momentarily. I will talk about preseason injuries before though, because if there's any whiff of preseason injury, like it's just bad news going into the season. Like we just talked about it with Christian McCaffrey, right? And it feels like we talk about this kind of every year, right? Or if it's like, I don't know, this player had an injury coming into the season. Well, wouldn't you know, they disappointed and like basically shot yourself in the foot to kick yourself out of the fantasy playoffs. I drafted Puka Nacua in one of my leagues this year. And I barely squeaked into the playoffs. I had to wait 6 weeks for Puka Nacua because he ruptured his fluid sac about a month out from the regular season in his knee. We all thought they were rushing Puka back to be ready for week 1. And wouldn't you know, he misses the next 5 games because he's recovering from this knee injury, right? Now, again, ever since he returned, he's been phenomenal. He got me to the 3rd place game. Frankly, should have been the championship. Screw you, Malik Willis, Jaden Reed. Literally garbage time, 4th and 2, 6-yard pass. I still lose sleep over that. But I didn't have any time to waste though because I'm out debatably my first round pick for 6 games. Like, if you knew that coming into the season, you would not have taken him at the 1-2 turn. Christian McCaffrey, I mean, did we get gaslit to some extent? Yes, we did. But did the fantasy community also just to a lot of extent? I tried to spare, but also, like, could we as the fantasy community maybe have paid a little bit more attention and maybe like sounded the alarms like a little bit more urgently around Christian McCaffrey? Like, we just kept blindly drafting him as the 101. Yeah, don't give me that look. CMC was still the consensus 101. The best ball community got a little bit funky with it at that point, but in redraft leagues, it was CMC 101 until people actually had concern, because we didn't actually know that it was Achilles tendonitis until after the regular season started, which is just like a crazy thing to hide for the entire preseason, right? So if there's any whiff of injury coming into the season, it's best to just like put a pause on where you're drafting that player and probably look elsewhere. Like, T. Higgins is a unique example this year. I think he's kind of the outlier because he picked up an injury late preseason and missed the first 2 weeks. He missed 3 more during the middle of the season too. But his ADP was in the 5th round, 60th overall. It doesn't really matter because he's also been top 5 in fantasy points per game this year too. So like, he's a massive outlier in this case. But any whiff of injury preseason, more times than not, let's just pivot and look at someone else in the same range because odds are you're going to get some missed time from that player, and that's just not something you can afford early on in the season.
Yeah, I mean, Cooper Kupp from 2023 is
totally
the same exact thing coming into it. Jonathan Taylor as well coming in with the ankle injury. It just is, there's just so many examples, and like you said, you're taking with your first 2 picks, your first 2 rounds, you're drafting in there. There's so many good players that you can take. So why would you take somebody who's already got a question mark coming into the season, right? Why wouldn't you want? Because we always say you're not going to win it in your first 2 rounds, but you can lose your fantasy league in your first 2 rounds. So yeah, I think, you just, if there's a red flag already coming into that season, not like a past, he tore his ACL 2 years ago, but hey, as of the last week, he's been dealing with a hamstring strain that he can't walk on, then yeah, don't draft him in your first 2 rounds.
Ty, anything you want to add before we bring up our final lesson learned here, which I think is a very good pivot point off of this discussion?
Go ahead and pivot.
The last lesson learned, as we tell you every year, there is no such thing as a safe pick in fantasy football. Because let's say you did pivot off of CMC at the 101. You did look elsewhere other than Puka Nacua. If you looked at a CeeDee Lamb, if you looked at an AJ Brown, if you looked at a Tyreek Hill, I mean, all of these dudes were massive disappointments in the first round. There's no such thing as a safe pick because we kept pushing these wide receivers up, as you talked about, Ty. And I think part of the reason was they're safer, right? They're not playing human bumper cars as frequently as these running backs are when you're basically asking them to run in between 300 plus pound men on the other side of the ball and ask them to truck through them and make plays. They're safer. They weren't this year, right? And once again, we learned the lesson of, okay, all right, even the wide receivers aren't safe. So, which almost then it brings me back to like one of the first things that we talked about was, what is the balance actually going to be? Because if there's no safe pick, I think it's silly to just push running backs all the way up the board again. But at the same time, we can't push wide receivers up anymore either because they've now been deemed unsafe as well. I mean, and we didn't even bring up some of the other running back wide receiver injuries throughout the year. I mean, Cooper Kupp missed some time. Chris Godwin, obviously, down for Rashee Rice, another one, right? Like, there was so many different wide receiver injuries this year where it's like, even in the 4th, 5th round, where it's like, man, you know what? I think I got a really solid value on that guy. They ain't safe either. They're not exempt from the potential injury concern either. It's the NFL. Daryl Thompson, former Green Bay Packers running back. I don't want to flex. It sounds like a flex, but went to school with his son. I got to chat with Daryl a little bit throughout my childhood. But he always said, like, when we played basketball is a contact sport and football is a collision sport. And that just rings so true in this scenario. If anybody can get hurt at any time, because these dudes are literally putting their bodies on the line every single week. So, we can try and deem one player safer than the other, one position safer than the other. But at the end of the day, all it takes is one hit. and
Mhm.
these dudes' careers are changed forever. So in fantasy football, no such thing as a safe pick. Anything you two want to add on top of that?
Yeah, you just look at, I mean, just through the top 24 picks, 13 of them either had something, an injury to them, and it, like Christian McCaffrey, CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, both lose their starting quarterbacks. Breece Hall doesn't look like himself. AJ Brown misses time. Jonathan Taylor misses time. Garrett Wilson has Devontae Adams traded to his team.
Yep.
Right. That you're like, oh, he didn't get hurt. His quarterback didn't get hurt. Well, he had an alpha wide receiver come play for his team. Puka Nacua misses time. Marvin Harrison disappoints. Travis Etienne loses his job. Isaiah Pacheco gets hurt. Drake, or not Drake, Chris Olave gets hurt.
Right.
So you can't tell me that, oh yeah, well, if you just did that, 13 of the top 24 consensus guys
50%.
disappointed in some way. That wasn't just, except for like maybe Travis Etienne and Marvin Harrison. That wasn't just, hey, they were not great for fantasy football, right? It was like they got hurt or someone else got hurt. There's just so many factors that go into this that there just isn't a safe thing. So you just take the best player in the best situation in the first 2 rounds, and you just pray that they don't get hurt.
Yeah, I'll say this too. Fantasy football is a game of risk management.
Mhm.
There is no such thing as, this player has little to no risk. Every player has a risk. So if somebody tells you that this is the safest pick, that should like raise a flag in your head. Like, that doesn't sound about right. Again, things happen. People get hurt. People get traded. People get cut. It happens, right? But what you need to do as a fantasy manager is being able to pivot when necessary, right? That's why we're here. So that's why you should subscribe and follow us, because we're here to give you those tips throughout the year.
If you want to make sure you follow us on our other socials as well, FF Fellas on Twitter, the FF Fellas on Instagram, Fantasy Football Fellas on Facebook, and the good old TikTok, which, hey, you know what? Might be saved. It's a day-by-day sweat with TikTok here. It's a good old-fashioned sweat with TikTok. We wouldn't want it any other way in the sports world here. Just kidding. I would just prefer if I didn't have to sweat, but I digress. Make sure you follow our other content as well, because, again, we are with you throughout the entire offseason. We're not going anywhere. Down to 2 episodes a week now, but again, not going anywhere. We're going to keep talking fantasy football, dynasty fantasy football, the NFL draft with you all. Plenty of content in store. Like, I'm looking ahead. I've been working a little bit on our offseason schedule coming up here. It's got me excited. I love this time of the year where we can project the future of the league and talk a little bit more big picture, a little bit more managerial perspective from a dynasty format. So if you're interested in Dynasty, want to try out Dynasty, have been playing Dynasty for multiple years at this point, again, subscribe, turn on those notifications so you know when all of our newest episodes are up. I am at Lucas Wenzel on Twitter, CamLawFFF for Cameron, Tyler _Plath for Tyler. We'll be back later this week. Make sure you head over. Oh gosh, I should have said this at the top. Make sure you head over to our socials, our Instagram specifically. We are going to be running polls on our Instagram story for our fantasy awards show on Thursday. So you can place your vote. We'll have a little bit of discussion around who we think should win each award. But as of right now, I've got 10 different awards laid out that need a lot of opinions put in. We'll announce the people's winner at the end of each award. We'll also talk about who we would give each award to as well. So that'll be a fun episode to wrap out the season. Make sure, if you want your thoughts heard, to go visit our Instagram page, the FFL is over on Instagram. We can put that in comment down below too. Make sure people know where to vote. Appreciate you all hanging out with us. We will see you later this week for a little bit of fantasy award fun. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you then. Deuces.
Deuces.